Okay, so now that we've talked about what as a business you can do in virtual reality, we want to talk about when you should actually start doing some of these things. As we've said many times, virtual reality is just not quite there yet. But we know that eventually it's going to be really, really big and it's going to realize the potential that it has. And so we want you to position your business in the best way possible so that you're ready when it hits that mass adoption stage. So we're going to talk about the benefits and the disadvantages as well to early adoption, because that's where it's at right now. It's at an early adoption phase. We'll talk about the benefits, we'll talk about the disadvantages, and then we'll conclude with what's the best time to actually enter the field of virtual reality. So let's get started and let's get into the slides. Okay, so that question, what can you do today? So let's backtrack a little bit. In one of our previous videos, we talked about one very important concept, and it's that VR is simply not there today. What do we mean by that? Well, it's only being used by a tiny fraction of people. It certainly has a long way to go in terms of growing to that mass adoption stage. We know that the tech is really only about 5% of what it will eventually become, and we covered that in an earlier video in terms of what we expect the hardware and the software and all the different interesting things that VR will do in the future will become. We know that profitability right now is pretty niche. Some companies are definitely profiting, others are investing quite a bit and haven't really seen those profits yet, and others are just simply unprofitable. But we know that there is profitability right now, it's just simply not there today. We know that the media and analysts love to use those words like overhyped. They don't really understand the technology, they don't really have that vision that people within the industry have. And we know that talent is relatively sparse, so there's quite a few people who have the development talent, they can code the VR, but the design talent, the people who can actually create a really good piece of content, not really there right now, and people are certainly learning these things, but it's not quite there today. And finally, we know that the industry changes quite literally by the day. Nobody can predict exactly what it's going to look like. We can make our predictions, we have evidence, we know what people are working on and what they're developing, what they're investing in. But what we don't know is what it's going to look like 5 years from now. It's simply impossible to predict, and there's too many people doing all these different wonderful things. We don't know how they'll interact. We don't know what will be successful. So the industry, it's really important to understand all the different news and investment that's taking place because it really does change every single day. But the important thing to realize is that all these very same things were true of PCs, and they were true of the internet in the early to mid 90s. Just like then, it is a mistake of historic proportions to overlook VR today. So really, really important point that I want to underscore. Don't buy into the hype of what it is today. Really important to look to the future and what it will become, because this is truly a revolutionary technology. Okay, so I want to talk about adoption. So is it really important right now, knowing that it's not quite there, but it's going to get there at some point? A lot of people have predicted, and myself being one of those people, that it'll probably get to that really mass adoption type stage within the next 3 to 5 years. But what should you do today? Should you be an early adopter? So we want to give you some disadvantages, and then we'll go to the advantages, and we'll conclude what's the best time to enter the VR space. So in tech, being an early adopter can generally be pretty risky because it changes so much, and you don't want to commit fixed resources to something that is changing so often. So in hardware, the companies that are first to market don't always make it to the maturity phase. In a couple examples, PCs, we know that the early companies were IBM, Apple, and various other computing companies. By the middle phases, the IBM actually got replicated by many other companies, and it actually drove them from the hardware business. And then they sold off Lenovo. Apple struggled. We know all about the struggles that had kind of in the middle phases of the PC market. Companies like Dell, HP, Compaq, and Gateway thrived at that time. So then, as the market matured, we know that Apple reemerged, but a lot of those other companies that were successful, they didn't really grow a whole lot, and in some cases they actually struggled. The reason is that PCs became more or less a commodity that mostly differentiate on adding or subtracting features and then on price based on those features. So a bit risky for some of those companies to have been early adopters in that space. Mobile was pretty similar. So the early mobile companies, you remember, were ones like Ericsson, Nokia, Motorola, those sort of names. Then in the middle stages, design became much more prominent, And of course, BlackBerry emerged. And then in maturity, while some of those companies are still around, they're not dominant in the market anymore. It's mostly a two-way battle between Apple and Samsung. So the early adopters in both of these hardware examples weren't necessarily the ones that stuck around into maturity. Now, in software, a little bit of a different story. The top companies really often continued thriving, but really only the ones that constantly innovated. So examples of that are Oracle and Adobe, who have done well for decades. They've been around since the 80s. However, there have also been a lot of competition in various software functions, and there have been some who have done quite well, some who have not done quite well. But in software, if you can constantly innovate, you generally have a bit more staying power. Now, many viable companies actually time the market incorrectly. So in the early stages, we have to know that profitability is difficult because demand is very niche at that point. Likewise, tech markets change so rapidly, and they destroy companies that either lack innovation or they build up some very fixed costs, very fixed infrastructure at the beginning, and they can't take advantage when the market starts to change. So if you're an early adopter, you certainly need to be very wary of the fact that the market is changing and you don't want to be too focused on profitability right at the very beginning. Now, there are some extreme early adopter advantages, and we want to be real clear about that. So the first is that if your product is good enough, it really is advantageous to take that market share initially and then acquire any competitors, any innovators that come along. So that way you can build some really strong barriers to entry, and if someone actually overcomes that barrier, then you acquire them. So definitely worthwhile if you're a Microsoft, for example, who was so dominant early on, and they've been able to really have that staying power because they acquire so many different companies. So the next point is that early adopters, a big advantage is that you can define the industry. And when you're defining what you're doing, you can actually build the product around your organizational strengths. So an example of that is Facebook right now. What they're trying to do is gain market share with the Oculus as a headset, but not necessarily have such a long-term profitability vision for the headset. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to gain strength in the App Store and all the synergies with the part of the business that exists right now. So their strengths right now are data accumulation and ads and social media. So they're trying to use the Oculus infrastructure and the customers that come along with it to really push all of the things that they're great at, social media and data. So the Oculus kind of formulates that strategy, and it allows them to really shape the market, the total VR market, in things that benefit themselves. Now, for another type of business, one that's not primarily in virtual reality but just wants to enter the market, establishing a reputation early is extremely important. So a variety of different ways, and I really want to go through these in detail. So first is that you accumulate loyal customers. If people know you as a strong player in the VR industry, gosh, that has some really big advantage of, first of all, developing early customers, and then by using your product to do quality things for them in that space, you accumulate loyalty as well. Likewise, you get tons of good reviews, and that's important because as an early adopter with good reviews, you have so much staying power. You have such a good reputation from those reviews. It's so much harder to generate good reviews and show the market how wonderful you are if you're a late adopter, because someone else has already generated the reviews and are going to get a lot of those new customers based on those. The next thing is search engine optimization. So if you were to start a company today in any of these crowded spaces that exist online, it's a lot harder to do today than it would have been, let's say, 10 years ago. And the reason is because of search engine optimization. If you build credibility and you're on that first page of Google today, you're going to have a very successful business. But right now, getting on the first page of Google with a new business is very difficult to do because there's already companies that exist in that space and they're doing great things in that search term, for example. So being early, getting that search engine optimization up front is going to be a lot easier than trying to do it later on. The next thing is credibility, media coverage, and name recognition in the industry. That's a big thing if people associate you with your VR product. Partnerships and joint ventures, that's another really good reason. Establish those partnerships early before your competitors can do that. You can build a talented and experienced workforce so that you have the best expertise in the industry and those people know exactly what to do no matter how VR changes. That's a really, really useful thing to do now. And then, of course, investment is easier when you have all of these different things. If you require outside investment or even just within your own organization trying to convince your leadership that you should do this, it's much easier when you can say, hey, we have customers, we have reviews, we have SEO, we have good media coverage and good joint ventures. We have a really experienced and highly talented workforce. That's really easy to make the case than to say, you know what, we can be successful in that industry, and making that case to investors is so much easier. So as the market achieves saturation, these things, all three of these things, become exponentially more difficult. Achieving early reputation might not be profitable right now. If you're aiming for profitability in 2017, even 2018, it's probably not going to be a good time for you to be an early adopter. But if you recognize the benefit of entering the market right now, realizing all of these different benefits, and then ultimately getting good NPV on into the future, then it might be a much better investment for you. And at that point, being an early adopter has tons and tons of advantages. So a couple of conclusions for VR. First, if you're a hardware company, we think that waiting might actually be the smart move. So companies like Apple and Google seem to be taking that strategy a little bit. They're certainly releasing products, at least in the case of Google, and Apple's rumored to be doing something later this year. But you can see that they're kind of slow playing it so that they can enter at the optimal time. And we think in the case of both of these companies, we predict they'll use their substantial cash reserves, which they have quite a bit of, towards some strategic VR acquisitions. They'll know who the strong players are and who they want to acquire. They'll avoid those early losses prior to mass adoption. The strength of their R&D teams ensure that they're not really losing in-house expertise because they're already investing quite a bit right now. And they can study the market, formulate the most strategic plan, and then ultimately act on that. And the example of that is both of those companies doing that in the mobile market. Google did it with their Android mobile platform, and then Apple did it with the iPhone. They were late adopters, and that ultimately proved fruitful for them. So we think they'll probably do that for VR. And if you're a hardware company, you don't have to be on the size or scale of those companies. But if you're a hardware player, it might be wise to wait around and figure out what the market looks like. Now, if you're a software or a content creation company, the advice here is to really establish yourself immediately, because we think VR will mature under some very accelerated timelines. We think it'll be within the next 3 to 5 years, and the benefits to that early entry are so big, especially in these sort of spaces. Other businesses that don't necessarily want to create direct content or don't want to directly play as a full VR company can benefit quite a bit from a VR presence, and they should also consider early entry. But it should be for reasons other than immediate profitability. So being an early e-commerce player offers a sales medium that very few are utilizing. There's not much competition there, and it allows you to shape yourself and really establish yourself as a dominant player, kind of like Amazon did in the early days of the internet. Marketing costs are quite low right now because nobody else is doing it and there's little competition. So ROI, even though you might not get a ton of revenue from it, because the costs are so low and because it's so easy to experiment, it can actually be quite tremendous if you start it right now and do it quite well. The data obtained in VR is going to be extremely valuable as the market matures. So if you have access to that data and you really know the market, you really know the customer base there, that can be a strength position that you can take to the mass adoption stage. Building in-house expertise prior to that mass adoption allows you to move much quicker once this becomes a much more profitable market. So building some of that knowledge in-house, getting the right players, and getting them working on the right things, that's a definite benefit for you to consider. Now, we think that the earliest mass adoption tools will actually center around training and communication. So you can right now, or maybe within the next year or two, save significantly on things like travel costs, facilities costs, learning and development, recruiting, and many more things. So it's not just a tool for a customer-facing market. It's not just a medium to sell to other businesses or consumers, but you can use it for some of your internal efficiencies as well. Finally, barriers to entry are quite low right now. Experimentation is low cost, but capable of delivering some very large benefits. There's not a whole lot to lose by getting involved in VR and at least starting to formulate a strategy. That's definitely something that we would advise any company to at least think about, invest a little bit in, and if you decide it's not for you, then that's fine. But really think about it because this is a great market. And just like in 1995, you wouldn't want to have said, you know what, that internet, I don't think it's for us. You wouldn't want to have been that person. The same thing is true for VR today. You want to get involved early. You want to assess the market and figure out where you can really play up to your strengths, and you can establish yourself in this very interesting technology. So definitely something to consider. Okay, so we've covered everything we want to cover in terms of what the VR market is right now. In our next video, we're going to talk about reverse tide and how we can help you do all the things we just talked about now. How can you start a strategy? How can you establish yourself in the market? How can you even decide if it's something worth pursuing? And we want to help your business. So in the next video, we'll show you exactly how we do it and how you can get started today.